3 African nations just built their own banks, quietly, without asking the IMF, France, or anyone else. No news coverage, no outside funding, no approvals, just silence, and a bold new financial weapon. But what exactly did they create? And why is the West avoiding the conversation? Let's find out. Something monumental just happened in West Africa, in a low-key declaration that hardly made the news. At first glance, the establishment of a new financial organization by 3 landlocked nations appeared to be a straightforward regional endeavor. But if you look a little closer, you see that this wasn't your typical situation. This was the kind of breakaway that shakes the foundations of established systems. Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Mali, nations that are frequently reduced to statistics concerning insurgency, coups, and poverty, have just taken a risk. They established their own regional bank. The Confederal Bank for Investment and Development is the name of the organization. Don't be fooled by the bureaucratic nomenclature, though. This is not some innocuous government agency. This uprising is expressed in money. A bank with a single goal: to finance the future without meddling, supervision, or Western funds. It began with 500 billion CFA francs, or between 820 and 833 million. A substantial sum of money by any measure, but particularly for nations that were told they couldn't finance anything without outside assistance until recently. The money is no longer coming from Brussels, Washington, or Paris. It originates inside their respective economies, inside their reserves, inside their local networks. It's African currency intended for African growth. This bank's existence alone isn't what makes it so disruptive. It's the cause and the location of it. These are not Africa's economic superpowers. These nations are in the Sahel, countries caught in geopolitical turmoil, deserted by international allies, and subjected to sanctions. Nevertheless, they have accomplished something that experts claimed was impossible in spite of the pandemonium. They are taking charge of their economic future by subtly constructing the instruments of sovereignty rather than by demonstrating in public places. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was not ostentatious. No international dignitaries at the gala. Investors were not the target audience for the launch. It was not an aesthetic issue. It had to do with intent. This type of desire indicates that something more significant is happening. These nations are no longer in need of assistance. They're saying that they don't require it. And they're doing it with deeds rather than words. 3 nations that were formerly a part of the Francophone West African economic system, linked to the French-backed CFA currency, and intricately involved in organizations such as ECOWAS and the West African Economic and Monetary Union, would be served by the Confederal Bank. However, since 2023, these same nations have begun to reorganize their relationships, expelled French soldiers, and withdrew from ECOWAS. As a result, when they claim to have constructed a bank, it's not just a bank. Rather, it's the last phase of their exit strategy, an indication that they won't be returning. This is when the narrative becomes even more disturbing. For everyone watching, not for them. This was more than a reaction to loneliness. The escalation was planned. Following economic pressure, political exclusion, and sanctions, these countries took an uncommon step in global politics. They ceased to respond and began to construct. They did not respond with diplomatic outrage or threats. In response, they produced something material that increases their independence, decreases their vulnerability, and makes them more difficult to manipulate. You must consider what this bank replaces in order to comprehend the scope of what is taking place. For many years, donor-backed initiatives run by non-governmental organizations and foreign contractors, as well as organizations like the World Bank and the African Growth Bank, have shaped the region's growth. These collaborations' fine language frequently required ceding authority, changing regulations, and agreeing to scrutiny by those in charge of the finances. That script is reversed by the Confederal Bank. It returns decision-making and funding to the local community. Furthermore, this move isn't symbolic. It is designed to finance actual projects, infrastructure, industrial growth, and agriculture, sectoral areas that the IMF is consistently too slow to support and too fast to politicize. You don't have to establish your creditworthiness to a Western economist who has never been to a Sahelian village when you work with this bank. No need to fulfill growth goals formulated in boardrooms abroad. The only prerequisite is that the initiative benefit the local community rather than international investors. The West's lack of response to this action says a lot. There is no media frenzy, no expert committees questioning how this would impact the stability of the region, and no outcry. It seems as though the only remaining tactic is to act as though it never happened. Because recognizing this bank is recognizing something far riskier than a simple financial transaction. It entails recognizing Africa's capacity to develop its own systems. That the three coup nations are capable of planning, coordinating, and taking the lead. Therefore, the Confederate Bank enters the scene quietly and defiantly rather than with much fanfare. It's not ostentatious. It doesn't want to make headlines. However, it is designed to endure, and more significantly, to expand. The question now is, why did they do this? You need to look beyond the numbers to see why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger established this bank. Ambition was not the source of this. Exhaustion gave birth to it. Something finally broke after decades of waiting, cooperating, and conforming to development partners' expectations. Not in outrage or protest, but in clarity. These countries didn't decide to establish banks overnight. They came to a conclusion that few others have dared to express. There has always been a rig in the game. The Sahelian people were told for years that foreign help would bring them salvation. Every new government was supposed to shake hands with Benin diplomats who managed the aid flow, pursue reform packages, and demonstrate its allegiance to foreign financiers. It started to happen frequently. A tiresome, embarrassing ritual. Although leaders changed, the regulations remained same. Adhere, borrow, and act as though it's helpful. What did they receive in exchange? Airports that never got going. Roads that didn't lead anywhere. Initiatives that terminated quietly after ribbon cuttings. For the headlines, the appearance of development was sufficient, but not for the people. The reality is that a large portion of this aid was intended to maintain rather than end dependency, something that Western governments and international banks hardly ever acknowledge. They ceded their policy space in return for loans. They gave contracts to foreign companies in return for assistance. They saw their sovereignty erode in the name of cooperation. They were instructed to wait each time they requested agricultural investment. They were told it was too dangerous each time they suggested local industry. However, the money came in every time a multinational corporation sought access to its uranium, cotton, or gold. Mismanagement is not what that is. That system is operating precisely as intended. Additionally, these nations have had enough. For this reason, their decision to construct their bank was emotional as well as strategic. The goal was to restore the dignity that had been damaged by years of financial dependence. We're no longer asking. It was about conveying a message. They do not oppose progress. They are turning away from the developmental paradigm that initially caused their dependence. However, this uprising has a deeper dimension than just financial. The world rejected the Sahel States Alliance, ECOWAS, as a defensive pact when these three nations founded it in 2023. After being suspended from ECOWAS, they need something to stay afloat. However, desperation did not give rise to the AES. Alignment gave birth to it. Africa can no longer afford to be tactful about its pain. According to this political, cultural, and intellectual alignment. That is what binds Chiani, Guita, and Traore together. They control narratives in addition to ruling nations. Narratives that defy filtering by donor-funded media outlets or Western thought groups. They have said unequivocally that their revolutions are psychological as much as military. Their goal is to convince their people that the days of constantly looking out are over, and that waiting is no longer necessary. Therefore, in the Western sense, this bank is not a financial entity. It resembles a machine that tells a counter-narrative. It rewires the concept of development. These leaders are deciding to demonstrate its value to their own people rather than to international investors. They're creating mechanisms that enable day-to-day living to go on without begging, rather than adjusting GDP to improve credit ratings. But don't get me wrong, this was more than simply internal annoyance. A trigger was present. The mask came off when France withdrew its troops, imposed sanctions, and stopped providing aid as a result of their refusal to adhere to democratic standards. These countries realized then that their friendship with the West was not unconditional, that the assistance ceased as soon as they disobeyed. And then something came up that altered everything. Were we ever genuinely sovereign if they could cut us off so easily? At that point, the bank's concept became a line in the sand rather than a side project. Additionally, this promise held true throughout time, in contrast to many other post-colonial ones that did not, because it was based on memories rather than ideology. The recollection of how their currencies were manipulated, their economy plundered, and their futures secured by beaming technical specialists and diplomats. They're remembering, not paranoid. They did, in fact, construct a bank. They actually constructed a wall, though. A barrier between their future and those in charge of it in the past. And that wall suddenly appears dangerous from the outside, since it is not to progress or peace, but to the whole system that ensured these countries never had the means to dream without authorization. They stopped dreaming under other people's roofs and constructed the bank. However, what would this bank do in reality? Thus, they constructed it as a guide for the future as much as a rejection of the past. It's hardly a vanity project, though. This is not a revolutionary monument. Money, materials, machinery, and brains are all intended to be moved by the Confederal Bank for investment and development. It's not here to make an impression. It is here to make the necessary repairs that no one else would. The West discussed infrastructure investment for years. However, there are still potholes and dusty roads connecting these three nations. The only thing that changed was the consultants and their findings, even though the World Bank would announce multi-million-dollar railway projects. The Confederal Bank is now filling the void left by broken promises. What's its top priority? Rewiring the bones of the area. We are referring to rail lines that link the uranium hubs in Nigeria with the industries in Mali, and then to the distribution centers in Burkina Faso. Nor to ports for export, nor to Europe, but to one another. For that is the distinction. This has nothing to do with exporting raw commodities to make money abroad. The goal is to create internal networks that support local labor and industry. The only viable routes for many years were those that led resources out of Africa. The goal of the Confederal Bank is to reverse the trend, to connect miners to refiners, farmers to processors, and goods to local markets. It's the liberation logistics. However, steel won't be enough to drive this change. Energy will be the future battlefield. The Confederal Bank is supporting a different future in an area dominated by imported gasoline prices and ravaged by blackouts. Energy grids that are locally maintained, decentralized, and renewable. The strategy? Large-scale solar farm investments, particularly in areas with the highest levels of energy poverty and sunshine. These mega projects are not foreign-built and do not need IMF oversight. Residents of the area are funding these community-powered microgrids. Because schools remain open as long as the lights remain on. Refrigerators are operated by clinics. Local companies no longer rely on diesel. Development suddenly becomes a reality. However, energy is just one component of the chain. The other is food. The Confederal Bank is getting ready to make a significant foray into the food processing and agricultural industries. Through national distribution centers, village-owned companies, and local cooperatives rather than international agribusinesses. In its simplicity, the objective is radical. Eat what they grow and grow what they eat. These nations have depended on imported wheat, rice, and processed commodities for far too long, even though they had more than enough soil to flourish. Why? Because funding for food self-sufficiency was discouraged by the aid system. Importing was usually less expensive, not because the land was unproductive, but rather because local farmers were left with mush-eats and droughts while foreign food came with subsidies. That formula is being reversed by the Confederal Bank. Farmers now have access to the full chain: equipment, irrigation, storage, and processing. They now purchase tomato paste in cans from Europe instead of selling tomatoes for pennies. It's not charity. Agricultural sovereignty is this. Additionally, it is being constructed one hamlet, one tool, and one crop at a time. Then there are the heavens. Indeed, colonization has even spread to the skies. International airlines have controlled regional travel in West Africa for many years. It's a cruel joke. It is frequently necessary to travel through Europe in order to fly from one African nation to another. Now, it is different. A regional airline that operates direct flights from Bamako to Niamey to Ouagadougou, free of layovers, visa restrictions, and legacy carrier price gouging, is being established by the Confederal Bank. The goal is to establish an aviation corridor that promotes regional trade, tourism, and education, all of which are vital to regional integration, but have never been profitable to international investors. However, it is more profound. Because movement isn't the only aspect of integration. It has to do with trust. Furthermore, money has never trusted the frontiers of Africa. For this reason, the bank is creating digital platforms and interoperable payment systems that let people and companies send and receive money and carry out cross-border transactions without the need for euros or dollars. No more depending on the French-backed CFA system. No more exorbitant costs for merely sending money to Niger from Mali. Unrestricted by colonial currency systems, the Confederal Bank is paving the way for genuine trade. Let's be clear too. Idealists do not operate this bank. Those who run it are strategists. Every loan, project, and investment will be made with consideration for national interests, long-term return, and risk management. They have observed debt traps. The fine print has been read by them. They have also discovered that free money is typically accompanied by unseen handcuffs. This time, they're establishing the conditions because of this. No, they have no billions. Not quite yet. They do, however, have intent. Astute, well-organized, and independently funded. The goal of every dollar invested is to address the kinds of issues that no foreign partner has ever given priority to. Because you drive in various directions while your hands are on the wheel. Catching up to the West is not the goal here. The goal is to construct what the West never meant to provide. You could view financial statements, project budgets, capital reserves, and numbers at the Confederal Bank. But only if you have an economist's mindset. You'll notice that it's not constructed like a bank at all if you take another look. It is constructed like a spine, a network, and a fortress. Because there is a much more ambitious goal hidden under the paperwork and loan programs: unification. For a reason not merely financial gain, about politics, of the policy, of individuals. Development isn't the only factor here. The goal is to bind the three countries to a common future that can never be broken by an outsider. Africa's history has been one of disunity for many years. Created disunity. In order to guarantee one thing, the boundaries, languages, currencies, and even time zones were determined. Fragmentation. Railroads are not shared by nations that share waterways. Foreign languages are traded by nations that speak the same language. It is common for neighbors who ought to work together to be obligated to different donors, to different creditors, and to separate agendas. It wasn't an error, it was a design. One that kept West African countries reliant on one another's vulnerability, as well as on outside funding. That wall is being blown through by the Confederal Bank. Through genuine investment, rather than treaties or talk shops, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are joining their economies and securing their futures together. Concrete fiber optic connections, collaborative ventures, and independent digital systems, not a handshake. This bank lends to more than just nations. It provides funding to a bloc. And that counts. Because you are no longer in three vulnerable states after your development plans, energy grids, transportation systems, and food networks are all in alignment. You are a single, well-coordinated unit. The Confederal Bank serves as the financial engine of the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, which operates on that fundamental tenet. Statements become infrastructure because of it. What makes vision into roads? What transforms the concept of ownness into a reality that exists on shipping manifests, spreadsheets, and the everyday commerce between formerly unfriendly communities? In fact, put the bank aside for a moment if you want to truly grasp the gravity of this situation. Observe what it is substituting. Regional integration used to imply ECOWAS. It appeared to be a powerful West African bloc on paper. In reality, it was paralyzed, centered on a colonial currency that was still based on the euro, dominated by bigger countries like Nigeria, and in line with Western policy. Smaller nations had to plead with ECOWAS for flexibility for years, and in exchange, they received bureaucracy. However, ECOWAS did not behave as a brotherhood when the Sahelian military administrations began to make decisions that the West disapproved of, such as kicking out foreign soldiers, rejecting unfair contracts, and exposing hypocrisy. It behaved like a police officer. Suspensions, prohibitions, closed boundaries, separation. Therefore, they weren't abandoning unity when the Sahel split out and established the AES. They were giving it a new meaning. Integration was not something they were opposing. It was being constructed on new terms. Furthermore, the AES is now more than just a political alliance because of the Confederal Bank at its center. It's a functional device. One that already has shared economic regulations, a budget, and a currency strategy in place. They are creating agreements for customs. They are creating collaborative procurement initiatives. A common market for essential commodities and services is what they are suggesting. All supported, organized, and carried out by the bank. This is where it becomes even more potent. Because unity is more than simply a tactic. It serves as a shield as well. These nations were vulnerable on their own. To overthrow. To penalties. To sabotage the economy. Together, however, they are far more difficult to influence. Much more difficult to separate. No more isolated failure spots. No more using the vulnerability of one country to undermine the others. Mali took over when Burkina Faso was cut off from aid. Alternative trading avenues were provided by its AES partners, while Niger was subject to sanctions. Additionally, they no longer have to defend themselves to uncooperative lenders thanks to a regional bank. Every time a Western organization modifies its governance standards, they are not required to restructure their economy. A closed loop has been established by them. One of self-determination, not of secrecy. And the entrance is the bank. You must abide by the AES's regulations if you wish to access opportunities, capital, and markets within this bloc. Not in Washington. Not in Paris. Brussels, no. The roles are reversed. African countries are establishing the framework for the first time, and other countries will have to choose whether to join on their terms. It's more than just a change in policy. That's a postural shift. The Confederal Bank is more than just a financial organization because of this. It serves as a political tool. Africa now has a fresh tool for assertion, rather than reaction. For creating reality rather than merely reacting to it. And it's already raising concerns outside of the Sahel. When Guinea requests to join the AES, what happens? When does Chad ask the Confederal Bank for funding? When a minor alliance accomplishes something that the AU hasn't been able to do for decades, this is no longer a local experiment. It is a prototype for a continent. It's also effective. Do you believe that anyone can now prevent African countries from achieving full independence? Do you still think that Africa is in need of assistance? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.